Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with Toronto-born jazz saxophonist and composer Joey Berkley. He opened up about his 2019 CD Moving Forward with a power lineup of great cats. This Toronto native came to music early since his mother was a jazz singer and listened to the records of Nancy Wilson, Anita O'Day, and other vocalists around the house. He settled on the tenor saxophone when he was 13, played local gigs while he was in high school, studied music at Humber College in Toronto, and after his graduation, he moved on to New York City. He gets into this and so much more, so please get to know Joey and dig this interview, my friends.
Joey, thanks for taking a minute out for Neon Jazz today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So talk to me about your latest 2019 CD, Moving Forward. You got four very, very talented individuals with you on this album. You're clearly happy by the way the sound of this album is. So talk to me about what kind of the creative aim of this project was.
The main driving force was to get back to some certain sort of fundamental ideas musically that I'd kind of, sort of left or just went in a different direction for a while, something more contemporary and bass band. That was my group Bandits. But I decided I wanted to get back to my roots, so to speak, and play my version of like straight up music. Like I grew up listening to Train and Miles, and this is not exactly a carbon copy of that particular era. It's not meant to be, but I think it shows those influences a lot more than anything else I've done recently. And it felt great to just get back to small group playing and interacting with these other four musicians that you mentioned, and they are all it's an honor to play together, and I think the record really captures a band sound, like a real band interaction that I think everyone can kind of hear. We weren't just showing up and doing a session. These were, the tracks on this record are the result of a lot of rehearsals and a lot of performances to iron the kinks out. So everyone sort of buys into the whole idea of it being a band.
Right on. So you were born and raised in Toronto. Your mother was a jazz singer. So talk to me a little bit about how, was that an overriding influence for you to get into jazz? How did you pick a horn? How did all that happen in your childhood?
Yeah, my mother was huge in that regard. She was very supportive, and and I started playing when I was in 7th grade, and by 8th grade she already had ideas about my future, and it wasn't about going to med school. So it was kind of like the reverse of what I think a lot of people that age experience. She wanted me to become a musician, and being around her all the time, listening to her records and what she was listening to, because she was performing a lot and would go out on the road and do different things. So I was influenced by, the music that she was listening to, certainly, and then the other musicians that I got to know through her, just that world of how that sort of social interaction happens amongst musicians. It's very different, I think, than other professions. But yes, so she was a huge influence in that regard. As far as saxophone, I had tried some other instruments too, but I didn't have a physical affinity towards them as much as I did the saxophone. Sometimes you can decide whether or not you like something in a second just by how it feels in the act of producing a sound, and like string instruments I had no feeling for whatsoever, which surprised me. And then, saxophone, it looked cool, and then it felt even cooler. So it was love at first sight.
So you had played some gigs in high school, and then you moved on to Humber College, and then went on to New York City. Talk to me a little bit about kind of your path to, what were some of the first professional gigs for you? And has the stage always been kind of a second home, a place where you feel comfortable, or do you have nerves, or how do you approach the stage?
Oh, stage is, most of the time, is the safest place to be, I feel. You know, it's where everything else in your life can kind of be either represented, actually, or put on hold. I mean, depends what we're talking about, good things, bad things, people. But when you're on stage, it seems like it can be like a sanctuary at times. That doesn't mean I don't get nervous. I still get nervous all the time. And frankly, I'm proud of that. You know, it's not something to hide or regulate or anything. I think it's something to use. It's definitely a very good springboard. You know, I would choose not to be, you know, having no nerves. You know, it's part of the performance. So I handle it by just accepting it and using it. Let it be in you. You know, don't try to get rid of it. I was a kid. I used to think all the professionals look so cool up there. How do they get to that point where they're not nervous? And I realized that most of them are. It's just they know how to do their thing regardless. You know, it doesn't become debilitating. So that's when I started to realize that, it made it a lot easier to be on stage. So now it's, you know, it's really just a place that I gravitate towards. And then as far as my early gigs, yeah, when I was still in high school, I was doing some gigs with professionals in Toronto who knew my mother and, you know, knew who I was. And so there was a bit of a fraternity or a family feeling, you know, in terms of how I was treated on the bandstand. But I mean, I still have some very, very funny sort of regular, like, these memories that have sort of like stuck with me all these years, and it's kind of sort of regulated the way I look at things in terms of going to a gig and all that kind of stuff. It was like my very first gig. It was like everything that could possibly go wrong went wrong getting to the gig, because I did not want to be late, you know. And it's just this whole ridiculous thing, but it was involving stepping in dog poop and having to clean it and smelling it on stage, and I'm like a kid in high school doing all this, and I felt, anyway, still very vivid in my mind. And it just was one of those sort of tests, I think, to see how bad you want it. Because when everyone else in the sax section was looking around like, you know, what's that smell? It smells like dog, you know, and someone even called it, and I was like, well, I don't smell anything, you know, and I just sat there and played my parts. And then, you know, I paid my dues doing all sorts of other gigs, you know, all the sideman stuff, and, you know, gigs that obviously a lot of them didn't pay. A lot of them didn't need to pay as far as I was concerned. You know, a lot of it was very educational in terms of learning how to play jazz. But obviously we got to pay the bills and make a living, so you can't just be, you know, a total sort of, you know, bohemian and money is material. I mean, you know, still got to eat and pay the bills. Yeah, I was able to find a balance, I guess, between certain types of gigs. You know, when I was getting called a lot for gigs, the first question I would always ask is, what kind of gig is it? Because then my second question was always, how much does it pay? So depending on the answer to the first question, then I had certain ideas about how much it should pay. But obviously, if it was a very cool gig, high music, and great players, you know, I didn't care what it paid, to be honest with you. So then the answer was irrelevant. But if I was going to be doing a club date, a wedding, a bar mitzvah, then yeah, we need lots of money. So, you know, it would determine the answer to the money.
So talk to me about the Westchester Jazz Orchestra, your association, how instrumental that's been in your growth as a musician.
It was a chapter of what I did. WJO, they, you know, I was one of the people that founded the orchestra and was the director for the first 3 years and played in the sax section. It was a great band, a lot of great New York players. A lot of players from New York City move up into Westchester, you know, once they have some kids and they're getting older and they're just getting tired of Manhattan. There's a lot of these towns just north of the Bronx that a lot of very well-known, famous musicians live. And this orchestra kind of represented that geographically. And was made up of some great players. You know, I had my run with that, and then after 3 years, I moved on to, you know, other things. So, I mean, for the moment, at the time, it was nice to be around those players that, you know, I had listened to on records for years and all of that, and have a chance to play together and make music and all that. So, on that level, it was helpful. And it certainly was a stepping stone for me to the things I was going to be involved in after that, as a leader and as a composer and arranger and a saxophone player.
You know, I think probably one of the things that's equally important for a veteran jazz musician is the education that they're involved in over their careers, and you've been pretty prolific in that. So give me kind of an idea of what you're doing right now and how big of a part of your music world that's been for you.
Yeah, teaching itself has become a huge part of what I do, and on purpose. You know, it's a very much a wanted aspect of my career. When I was younger, and like a lot of other musicians, you know, they tend to teach more when the gigs are light, and I was no exception to that, doing the same thing. But then I started to realize that there are so many gigs out there that we have to say yes to that we'd rather not do. Obviously, we need to pay those bills again. But after a while, that stuff started to become really toxic to me, certain types of gigs. And I frankly would rather teach and provide some knowledge to a young saxophonist or jazz musician learning how to improvise. Plant those seeds, whet the appetite, get the curiosity going, you know, keep the music going through teaching, through other students. I'd much rather be doing that than doing some, you know, whatever, commercial corporate gig or something that just really was only about the money, for me personally. And so teaching really started to become, I felt it was like an obligation or a duty as a jazz musician to keep the music going is through education, bringing up the next generation of saxophone players or whatever, any musician. And I still take that very seriously. I feel that we all have an obligation to do that as musicians, you know, keeping quality, the standard of excellence, keeping it in the public mind and in the public ear, because it seems like it gets lost a lot. So education is definitely what helps sort of combat against that complacency or laziness to expect more out of your musicians that earn a living putting out records, you know. I think that through education, the listening public becomes much more, their listening becomes much more critical in a positive way, where they have a certain demand for a level of playing that if you can't do it, then you just get off the stage, you know. I mean, or go practice, you know, until you can. So I feel that all of that is tied in and connected to teaching. And when I teach, when I'm playing or teaching, to me it's all the same sort of energy. You know, I don't usually teach it with the idea of I'm the teacher, you're the student. It's more like we're two musicians hanging out, and I'm going to show you some things because, you know, I've been doing it a while. And a lot of times I get that right back at me, too. I learn a lot as well. And, yeah, I mean, that's taken shape as going into schools and doing workshops and master classes and residencies, you know, in high school level, done some college. I've done it at every level. And they're all very rewarding in their own way.
You know, sometimes it takes a while for a musician to find their voice. So my question to you is this. When did you really truly find your voice? And what is that voice? What is your music voice?
Yeah, I mean, that's 100%. I agree with that statement. I mean, that's probably the hardest thing in the world is just to learn how to sound like you, because a big part of the process, a long part of the process of becoming a musician is to sound like other people. You have to understand the history of the music and the ancestry of where you come from. So you assimilate all those different things. When I was younger, I was listening every Coltrane solo, Dexter Gordon, and just like literally memorizing and all of these lines. And I feel that is a part of the process, but you got to go through the other side and continue on and then figure out how to make all of that, make it sound like you. And I've only probably in the past, I don't know, maybe 5 years, and I've been doing it a long time. In the past 5 years, I feel like I'm really starting to carve out a sound where people recognize it, either as regarding my writing or my playing. And that's a compliment to me. With someone, they may not even like it, to be honest with you. It doesn't matter. But if I can be identified, that's a great thing. I feel very proud of that. And like I said, it's probably within the past 5, maybe 7 years, out of a total of 40 years, that I feel like my voice is starting to become identified, and I'm starting to get a niche on it, which I guess is sort of a hybrid of listening to, again, John Coltrane, every version of Miles Davis. Michael Brecker is right at the top of the list. But I also love the Spinners, and I love listening to Hendrix, and I like Michael Jackson, and on and on and on, Earth, Wind, and Fire. So those are all important parts of my music as well. So I guess my style is a sort of a combination of all of those influences. If I listen to Sly Stone, I feel just as taken away with that, or Marvin Gaye, all the Motown stuff, as I do listening to Love Supreme. I know they're on different levels in terms of maybe what the intent is, but I just think it's all great music, and it all gets me, to that place in my mind and heart that just is where you want to be.
So what was one of the first jazz shows that you ever saw live that really moved you?
Oh, live. When I first moved to New York from Toronto, I remember there was a big festival going on at the Beacon Theater in the city, and seeing Sonny Rollins for the first time. He was on the bill, and when he came out and did what he does, I was just mesmerized. I mean, it was, I had only been in New York a little while, and here I am listening to Sonny Rollins on a stage that's pretty close, and yeah, that was a special night for me.
Right on. So everyone has a version of who they think you are, or their interpretation of you. Your family, your friends, your students, colleagues, but you know yourself best. Who do you think you are?
Who do I think I am?
Yeah.
Wow, that's a loaded question. I know a lot of people that would, maybe want to answer that for me. Who do I think I am? I think I am as a musician, I guess. I think I'm a student of music, and I'm just trying to practice and get better. It hasn't really changed. There's no difference between now and, 30, 40 years ago. It's the same answer, I'm like everyone else, trying to get better and practice and write and teach. That is who I am and will continue to always be. Just try to be a valuable person to my world around me, my immediate world, the people I love and care about. Means a lot to be, have a positive effect around your neighborhood, as a human being. So, I guess ultimately that's about it.
I like it. It's a great answer. Joey, thanks for taking some time out for Neon Jazz today. I appreciate it, man.
Thank you for reaching out. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in Toronto, Kansas City, New York City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Joey for his time, music, and stories. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, Enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.